Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Swift and I am the Chief Creative Director here at Resin Obsession. And today I'm coming to you because I want to show you how to use a heat gun to get rid of bubbles on your resin surface. Now there are 3 reasons why I like using a heat gun to help me pop air bubbles. So number 1, I think it tends to be a little safer than using something like a propane torch or a lighter because you don't actually have a flame involved, okay? And while there's not a 100% guarantee that there's not a fire risk, certainly if you don't have a flame, the risk is a lot less. Okay, number 2 is that this heat gun can produce a lot of heat with very little air behind it. And that's in contrast to something like a hair dryer, where if you were to use a hair dryer and go over your bezels, you're gonna blow resin everywhere before you ever have a chance to get the bubbles out. And then number 3, for those of you who do resin art and like to create a bunch of interesting cells and looks in your art, what's nice about this heat gun is you can get it down close to your surface and it can push the resin and blow the resin a little bit. And so you can create some really unique effects with that. So what I'm gonna do today is I've got a piece of glass here that's gonna go in a frame, and I've glued flowers to the glass. And then what I'm gonna do is mix some of my Resin Obsession crystal doming resin and apply that to the surface. And then I'm gonna show you how I use the heat gun to go over the surface to remove bubbles. Now, before I use the heat gun, a couple of safety things for you to keep in mind. Number 1, this tip gets very, very hot. So you don't wanna touch it, you don't wanna put your finger in there, you don't wanna look at it like that, it gets very hot. Number 2, you wanna make sure and use this stand, okay? Because this hot end can also burn or warp a table or a surface. So you wanna make sure when you put it down with that stand up. And then the last thing I'll tell you, which might just be me, but maybe some of you other guys do this too, be mindful of your hands and your gloves and all the resin you have on there before you touch the heat gun. I've got a few sticky spots on here because my hands really weren't probably clean enough before I went to grab it. So you don't want like a bunch of sticky resin then that you have to deal with. So wipe your hands really well before you grab your heat gun, and then before you put it away, you might ought to go over it with like a baby wipe or something just to get off any resin residue before it just gets that kind of sticky mess. So, okay. All right, so I'm gonna mix the resin, get it poured on the surface, and then I'll show you how to use that heat gun. So now that I've put my doming resin on the surface of my glass, what I need to do next is go over it with the heat gun. Now because the heat gun makes a little noise and it might be a little hard for you to hear what I'm doing or as I'm talking, I'm going to describe it here and then I'm going to zoom in and show you what I'm doing. So the heat gun generally does best when it's about about 2 inches or so off of your surface. You can always get it in closer, but I would tell you to start a little further out and then get it closer to your surface if it's not pushing or popping the bubbles. Know though that the closer you get to the surface, the more it's going to push the resin, so you need to be aware that you could push your resin off your surface like here, or you could push it out of a bezel. Now, one of the fun things about using a heat gun though is that you can use that pushing to your advantage, in that sometimes, especially in a mold when I'm using a heat gun, I will use the heat gun like this to push and basically rock the bubble and rock it out of, or get it out of a corner to help it then pop. So that's something fun you can do with it as well. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna zoom in. We've got some little micro bubbles in here. So I'm gonna zoom in so that you can see me using the heat gun on them and watch them pop. heat gun at home, you should hopefully see the bubbles, they've risen to the surface and they've popped. Much like when a bubble rises to the surface, say like you're washing dishes and you've got a bunch of soapy bubbles on your surface, and when they pop, you're gonna see that here, just obviously on a much smaller scale. And then one last tip I'll give you about using a heat gun with bubbles is that it only gets surface bubbles. So this is a really flat surface, the resin's in a really thin layer, so it's not a big deal. But if you're using a heat gun in a resin mold, if you've got bubbles stuck down at the bottom of your mold, a heat gun is not going to pop them. So you'll need to use something like a toothpick or your stirring utensil to get the bubble to the surface in order to pop it. Thanks for stopping by today. I hope you've learned a little bit on how to use a heat gun for your next resin project. If you need a heat gun, by all means, stop over by the Resin Obsession store. We have heat guns in our store, and I'll be sure to include a link in the video description. Happy resin time, everyone.